Olá para todos vocês. Gostaria de cumprimentar a todos que participam da conferência, bem como a todos que a acompanham pelo canal da UNB no YouTube. Todos são muito bem-vindos. É com grande prazer que apresento o segundo conferencista da primeira Conferência Internacional sobre o Ensino de Português como Segunda Língua para Surdos, o Dr. Robert Hofmeister. Agradecemos a você, Bob, por aceitar o nosso convite. O Dr. Hofmeister é um professor associado emérito da Boston University, onde atuou como diretor do Centro para os Estudos da Comunicação e os Surdos. O Dr. Hofmeister concentrou sua pesquisa em 5 áreas principais: a aquisição da American Sign Language por crianças surdas, pessoas surdas como um grupo de minoria bilíngue bicultural, problemas na educação de surdos, os efeitos da implantação de leis públicas sobre crianças surdas e a melhoria das interações entre pais ouvintes e seus filhos surdos. Particularmente, eu fui abençoada por tê-lo como orientador em meu doutorado na Universidade de Boston, de 2000 a 2005. O Dr. Hofmeister apresentará uma palestra chamada Aquisição de Língua Bilíngue e Educação de Crianças Surdas. Após a sua palestra, teremos alguns minutos para perguntas. Por favor, se você quiser fazer qualquer pergunta, coloque-a no chat. Então, vamos assistir a palestra do Dr. Hofmeister.
Hello. I want to thank the organizers and sponsors for the privilege of allowing me to present my ideas here. I especially want to thank Professors Nascimento and Bernardino for extending this invitation. And thanks to all of you who are taking the time in these unusual times to listen. A major issue in our field has to do with how we use terms. Language, communication, sign language, English, Portuguese, reading, and language assessment. This terminology affects teaching, research, and how we discuss deaf students. These terms appear regularly in our writings, research articles, and presentations. Yet we do not have an agreed upon definition and/or understanding of how they're used. I hope to clarify some of this terminology and present some ideas for bilingual education structure for deaf students. It is ironic that research on hearing baby signing indicates that baby signs and hearing babies improve vocabulary and cognitive development. Gestures in hearing children improve math. Pointing while reading improves vocabulary knowledge. Gestures while reading improves information access. Gestures also improves the delineation of objects in the environment. In the hearing side of the deaf business, parents are persuaded not to use a sign language and not to gesture when they have babies or toddlers. When we talk of a sign language in the deaf business, we tend to use the word communication. For example, manual communication, to refer to signing and gestures. This helps professionals avoid using respectful language names such as ASL, Libras, etc. This also complicates the discussion about bilingual education for deaf students. We spend way too much time in schools and programs serving deaf children, focusing on the service or delivery system, and not enough time on information access. Information or content acquisition is the goal of schooling. For deaf children, we also have to figure out how they can learn two languages. As I explain, as I proceed, we will discuss the two languages as a sign language and a spoken language via print. This means we need to spend more time on strategies to enhance learning information, to enhance storage properties such as working memory, long-term memory, to enhance recall strategies, as in creating stimuli that supports recall. We need to develop analytical strategies, such as meta-thinking about strategies to enhance learning information. We need to think about how language works, how we talk about complex topics, topics that could be complex in one language, but simple in another. We need to recognize and understand these ideas. For example, in ASL, bridge versus connect, two signs that have similar meanings or similar words in English. These are used to indicate meaning as in bridge the gap or bridge ideas between us. We need to enhance strategies to synthesize information. That is, to recognize or cross-transfer information from one language to another. For example, crossing categories. Nouns and verbs in ASL or Libras look like this. Nouns and verbs in English or Portuguese look like this. We need to develop meta-discussions about two languages and about how information is conveyed in each language. We need to recognize and respect the value of the two languages, just as we recognize and respect the value of English and Portuguese. Bilingualism for deaf and hard of hearing students is not about the importance of hearing, cochlear implants or hearing aids, etc. Bilingualism for deaf and hard of hearing students is about the value of two languages, an L1 and an L2 for all students. The advantage in thinking this way is that all deaf and hard of hearing students who have visual access are capable of learning bilingually. They will have access to incidental information, that is, environmental access. They will have the ability to view and develop labels for the world around them. Language is needed to put that world and its labels into some order. For deaf children, ASL, Libras, and print are the two languages that enable this process naturally. Why do we have such a difficult time applying these ideas to deaf students? Thinking of deaf students through a deaf lens allows us to establish strategies that enhance learning of information and content. Learning to view, store, recall, analyze, and synthesize information for future application. This is developing both background information and acquiring strategies to apply it to new information. We need to look at the research on spoken language and some research in sign language. Current research on the brain and reading is critical to understanding how deaf students access two languages. You will hear some important results from other colleagues in this conference on this topic. Work on the neural processing of reading is producing some very nice results that impact how deaf children may be operating. In recent bilingual reading research, the following factors, age and order of acquisition plus achieved proficiency or fluency, interact with neural pathways used for language tasks such as reading. This work demonstrates that reading acquisition gives rise to largely overlapping reading neural circuits in both languages. This supports our model of how deaf children acquire language in a bilingual system. This model is detailed in Hofmeister and Caldwell-Harris, 2014. Support for the model of common underlying proficiency has been building for the past 4 decades. When Cummins initially introduced the idea, it was critical for us educators of the deaf to understand the impact of this model and the research behind it. Specifically, the recent important brain research indicates that as one becomes more fluent in the L2, then the L1 sections of the brain become available for use. This means that as L1 and L2 move towards fluency, the brain processes used to acquire L1 and learn how to use L1 significantly overlap as L2 improves. This is a scientific way of saying that L1 knowledge and fluency supports the learning of L2 knowledge and fluency. These are critical findings because they suggest brain development and language development are overarching systems for monolinguals and bilinguals. When we look at the research on deaf people reading print, we find that signs are activated in the brain. The auditory processing sections of the brain are adapted to visual processing. This is critical for learning 2 languages in deaf students. We know that the earlier sign language is acquired, the better reader in L2. In addition, the more proficient in American Sign Language, the L1, predicts both skill in reading and knowledge of English, the L2. These results, although completed in ASL in English, should apply to Libras and Portuguese because all languages signed in print use the same brain mechanisms. This suggests that reading processes involved in visual processing generalizations are integrated with language, an important concept. We now know that L1 proficiency impacts the learning of L2. By extension, L1 proficiency impacts learning itself and learning in L2. This information begins to allow us to separate language as referring to ASL Libras and language as referring to a print form of language. The language centers in the brain appear to be relied upon when reading print. This again is a critical finding, and I keep repeating it. Proficiency in age directly impacts the learning of both types of language forms, ASL Libras and print, as in English and Portuguese. This is strong evidence that these languages are interrelated in deaf people. This brings us to how we talk about language in deaf education. How we talk about language creates misunderstandings and problems. The use of terminology in our field aids those who are anti-sign language and those who are on the surface appear to support deaf people but really have difficulty with sign language. The term language covers a huge range of interpretations. Language covers terms such as spoken, print, lip reading as examples. When we use it in conjunction with reading, it really becomes more complicated. When we talk about sign language, and I use ASL as the example, look at the range of terms we have. Sign language, total communication, manual communication, signed English, sign-supported speech, manually coded English, and so on. As I said earlier, we use the term communication to avoid giving sign language a positive framework. Many professionals will do anything to avoid having to learn, work with, or use ASL, or any natural sign language. Look at the numerous terms that we just used to avoid using ASL. I maintain that ASL or Libras are natural languages and are equivalent to spoken languages like English or Portuguese. We as a field do not intrinsically believe that ASL or Libras can deliver academically at the same level as English or Portuguese. Therefore, the focus of teaching is on English or Portuguese, not on learning content. Language, in this view, is really seen as equaling English or Portuguese. And learning, ironically, is measured by English or Portuguese. In this structure, there is no role for sign language. How do I know this? In the US, we have many different curriculum guides on how to teach ASL as an L2. These guides are focused on teaching hearing people how to learn a sign language, an L2 approach. In the US, there is only one curriculum that I know of created to teach deaf students about their L1. This is developed by Todd Zubek. And if you wish to know more, you can visit the website listed on the slide. The education of the deaf invests in adapting curricula used by the hearing to teach deaf students. The measures of success in schools and programs for deaf students are all conducted in their second language. And these measures, ironically, are mostly done using print, as I stated earlier. This system does not give us an adequate measure of what students know. It only tells us what they've been able to figure out with their limited knowledge of English or Portuguese. Their knowledge of English or Portuguese controls how they display what they know. This is not a measure of what they know. We do this for all our subjects in school. This must change. Later, I will discuss why it is important to think about sign language in teaching using STEM topics, science, technology, engineering, and math, as an example. To my knowledge, there are no content, subject, curriculum, or guides designed for ASL or sign language in STEM or even other content subject matter. As a first step, we must develop curriculum guides for teaching sign languages, ASL or Libras, as an L1 to deaf students. In the current state of education of the deaf, programs serving deaf students throughout the world have focused on teaching an L2 before an L1 is learned. When we think of teaching language to deaf students, educators of the deaf and all the associated fields immediately think of teaching the spoken language. Our expectation is for deaf students to use the L2 to function as their L1. This forces us to build an educational system around the spoken language, the L2. Even when looking at sign language learning in school, it's through the spoken language lens. We teach deaf students as if they were hearing students. We prove this by adapting and following hearing curricula. This adapting of curricula is completed through a hearing lens. That is why we have so many terms for signing. Terms that mean sign language is not good enough to use for educational purposes. Deaf students are capable of learning at the same level as hearing students. But we must recognize there are differences when it comes to learning languages. I emphasize the plural because it could be more than 2 languages. A critical difference is that hearing students arrive at school already knowing the L1. It is rare that hearing students arrive at school not knowing a language. Some might arrive at school not knowing the language of school. However, we do know for the hearing student who arrives at school from Portuguese-speaking homes, they already know the language of school. The school's job is then to refine and expand their knowledge of their language, the L1. Instruction is a meta-discussion of language. How to teach what a noun is, what a verb is, what a correct sentence is. This is teaching hearing students about L1 to L1 users. The average deaf student does not arrive at school with the same bag of tools. However, some deaf students arrive at school with a language. Others need access to learning a language. That is why we have to make schools and programs serving deaf students as bilingual places of learning. We must begin to view deaf students through a deaf lens. We must recognize that the terms language teaching or language arts are viewed through a hearing lens. These terms do not mean teaching language as an L1, but mean teaching about the L1 language. If we truly believe that ASL or Libras is equal to English or Portuguese, we would establish the same amount of time in teaching ASL or Libras as an L1, as we do teaching the current language arts or language classes. The way we do business now, we operate under the definition that language equals English or Portuguese, and teachers function in their jobs this way. This has to change. We must recognize that a distinction must be made between acquiring American Sign Language or Libras and learning about American Sign Language or Libras. Knowing this, we do a better job of teaching hearing students sign language than we do teaching deaf children sign language. We must invest in how to teach sign language as the L1 to deaf children. We need to think about how to develop curricula for the teaching of sign language to deaf students through a deaf lens, through a deaf language lens. In schools, we must establish as many ASL or Libras classes as there are English or Portuguese classes. We do not do a good enough job teaching ASL or Libras as an L1, or teaching about ASL Libras as an L1 to deaf users of ASL or Libras. We need to teach deaf students how to describe and think about ASL or Libras. We need to teach the rules and boundaries of the language as a formal language class. It is imperative we understand the distinction between L1 acquisition and learning and L2 acquisition and learning. To do this, we need to look at the characteristics of deaf learners through that deaf lens. I repeat that it is imperative that we fully understand the distinction between L1 and L2 acquisition and learning in deaf learners. To do this, we need to examine the characteristics of deaf learners through a deaf lens. We need to learn why we must examine differences between deaf children of deaf parents and deaf children of hearing parents. Many people say that deaf children of deaf parents are not representative of the deaf population. They are wrong. Deaf children of deaf parents are the models to understanding language and learning in all deaf students. We must fully understand how to design instruction in schools and programs for deaf students through this lens. I am not saying deaf children of deaf parents are better than deaf children of hearing parents, but through the hearing lens, we seem to only use the deaf children of hearing parents as the model for learning. This current model is not working and has not worked in over a century. Ironically, this model actually limits deaf children of deaf parents, and by association, deaf children of hearing parents' achievement in school. Deaf children of hearing parents are not necessarily the best learners, but they have the language skills to allow them to achieve. If we think about deaf children of deaf parents in terms of what they have, we can then think about models for all deaf and hard of hearing students. If we think this way, we can build a model that is truly a bilingual model. Let's quickly look at deaf children with deaf parents and hearing parents. Deaf children of deaf parents arrive in school with an intact language, with a solid conversational skill, with an idea of what language acquisition is all about. Recognizing that there's an L1 and an L2, knowing that they're supposed to learn a second language, knowing that language access to the second language will be through print, knowing that print is a form of communication as they see their parents using pagers, TTYs, computers, etc. for interaction, knowing that there are deaf and hearing people in the world. Contrast this with deaf children of hearing parents when they arrive at school. Deaf children of hearing parents arrive with a weak to a very weak L1, with little conversational skills, with no academic language, not knowing there's such a thing as an L1 and an L2, not knowing that they are to learn a second language via print. Print is a form of second language. Not knowing that print equals English or Portuguese, and that's an L2 for them. And not knowing that there are hearing and deaf people in the world. This brings us to understand, what does bilingual really mean for deaf students? Bilingual as two languages, an L1, a conversational language, and an L2, an academic language. This is true for deaf and hearing children. There is a difference between conversational discourse outside of school and academic discourse inside of school. Using our deaf lens, we can also begin to recognize that schooling for deaf students should include academic ASL or Libris. If we approach deaf children with the idea that they are bilingual, what can we do? We can think in terms of two languages, sign language as the L1 and print language as the L2. We see that both languages are visual languages. We can now look at the variables of the instructional environment from a different perspective. The view of the teacher, the view from the children, and the view of the classroom. We can think in terms of visual issues. How do deaf children learn visually, and what can we do to establish an efficient learning environment? When ASL and Libris is viewed as the L1, it's visual, using the hands and face. It's acquired in a face-to-face interaction. And technology is making sign languages accessible in a frozen form, much like print. English or Portuguese via print is viewed as the second language. It is a visual presentation. It uses 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions, as in sign language. It is acquired via reading, not face-to-face communication. But it can be used in an interaction dyad. Think of writing, texting, back and forth. Thinking this way establishes ASL or Libris as the L1 and print as the L2. Print requires reading the same as face-to-face interaction requires viewing or receiving visual input. The issue of acquiring Portuguese through print requires learning to read. Learning to read and acquiring a sign language have a lot in common. Kathy Harris and I have written a theoretical paper on how deaf children learn to read. This involves understanding of what reading means to deaf students who grow up bilingual. I have observed deaf children of deaf parents who are skilled in their L1. I have observed deaf parents read to them. I have observed these deaf children read to their deaf parents. These deaf children or deaf parents appear to map print directly to their ASL. They do not go through English. They view print as an extension of their ASL, much the way we map English print to what we know about English. For example, deaf children of deaf parents attach combinations of letters, we call words, to signs. They store this information in similar ways to how hearing children begin to learn to read the English print L1. Again, deaf children of deaf parents do not go through English. They organize print through their organization of ASL. When deaf children of deaf parents arrive in school, they learn that print is English, an L2, and it has different rules. They are able to bring an L1 to the learning process, much like hearing children do when they arrive at school. This is different for deaf children of hearing parents, as they typically do not have an L1. They are not learning a sign language in their home. This necessitates thinking very clearly and carefully about how language learning is impacted. The average deaf child of hearing parent arrives at school and must simultaneously learn to read and acquire English. As we all know, this is not an easy task. Unfortunately, the traditional structure for the average deaf child of hearing parents results in a weak L1 and a weak L2, which results, as we know now, in language deprivation, especially deprivation of the L2, the spoken language of school. But interestingly, also a weak L1, even if the school uses sign language as the language of instruction. What do schools need to do? We need to create measures that provide us with what students know. We need to separate language knowledge from content knowledge. We need measures that give us information how much sign language they know. Using sign language to assess knowledge yields 2 pieces of deaf students' capabilities. First, you're able to access content knowledge through a sign language interaction. Second, this produces an assessment as to the level of sign language knowledge. We need a separate measure on how much print language they know, and we need a separate measure on how much content they know. We need to improve teachers' understanding and use of academic ASL or sign language to enhance instruction of content information. Using sign language to assess knowledge yields two pieces of deaf students' capabilities. First, this produces a measure of the level of sign language knowledge. Second, you are able to access content knowledge through a sign language interaction. Teachers know what a student knows via print. Accessing content information via both languages allows the teacher to obtain a better picture of what a deaf student knows. A deaf student may know a great deal more than given credit for, but it is hard to determine this if the content knowledge is constrained by his language knowledge. If the sign language is weak, then the focus of instruction needs to be on improving sign language. This requires a larger portion of the day to be organized so that deaf student with weak sign language skills has the opportunity to increase and expand sign language knowledge and fluency. Instruction needs to be divided into improving L1 fluency, this means improving L1 at the conversational level, and introducing how sign language is structured for academic teaching about L1, moving into academic sign language. Some misconceptions are that signing equals understanding. Signing words in a book or in English or Portuguese word order does not mean comprehension. I have experienced many comments that student X is using ASL by teachers and administrators. These comments are made because students or administrators are made because teachers or administrators do not understand the student. I have found that inexperienced L2 signers are not skilled enough to make these judgments. Many of these students are not using ASL, but are attempting to present the signs they know, but do not follow ASL grammatical rules. Some students, in fact, are unable to express themselves in a coherent sign language. These instances underlie the need to establish language classes that distinguish between acquiring a language and learning the language from teaching about the language. My team and I have created an assessment instrument that is all in sign language, ASL. The ASL AI, the American Sign Language Assessment Instrument, is a comprehensive measure of what deaf students know in sign language. It measures breadth and depth of vocabulary, syntactic and syntactic judgment, and analogical reasoning. There is no print in the ASL AI. Deaf students are guided through the test using ASL. The ASL AI consists of multiple choice tasks, and they are both taught and learn how to take a multiple choice test. If you would like more information on the ASL AI, it's available on the website address displayed on the slide. Once we have control of how well a deaf student functions in sign language and in English or Portuguese print, then we can appropriately program for the best instructional practice for learning to occur. Recognize that Portuguese print will be accessible and reading will be used to learn a second language. Separate the learning of content from the learning about a language. Then, developing a program that sees that learning content is not dependent on learning content through print or the L2. We can develop instruction that uses the level of sign language known by the student to enhance learning, such as learning STEM and other content subjects, such as social studies. In a bilingual program design, ASL or Libris must be raised to the same level as subject matter content. We must teach content about the language. Instruction now recognizes basic underlying facts. L1 is ASL or Libris, L2 is English or Portuguese print. Instruction is now identifying the principles that underlie both languages and teaching about these principles. For example, correct versus incorrect sentences in L1. Describing types of sentences in L1, such as simple, complex, and compound. Explaining the principles of how vocabulary is developed in ASL or Libras and English or Portuguese, for example, is how to talk about simple lexical development. For example, using noun-verb pairs as an example in ASL as to how they are related also can be compared to how they are related and used in English. Inflectional instances in ASL, like blue versus dark blue, means adding variation in movement. English also adds variation in words by adding words. Once basic information is learned, the level of instruction increases to higher levels. For example, in metaphor, I have to use ASL, I don't know Libris, the idea of feeding the meter. Feeding the meter is a metaphor from feeding up oneself to feeding the meter. There are derivational forms such as park, or drive under, or drive in a garage. These are forms that are used in ASL to impart different meanings. These ideas provide understanding of basic and advanced language principles, the linguistic structure of language. Instructional strategies that teach about a sign language and a print language provide students with analytical skills. With these skills, they'll be able to recognize how and why spoken language influences how some people sign. For example, the difference between a math concept in ASL and a math concept in English. The idea of more than. I don't know Libras, so I will again use an ASL and English example. In English, X is more than Y. The ASL example is the sign for beat. Using the sign for more, this one, to request more, as in add to, is a different meaning than is being presented by the sentence X is more than Y. X and more than Y has the meaning of bigger than, which uses the ASL sign beat. This is through a deaf lens. If we use a hearing lens, the variation in meaning takes longer to figure out or learn by deaf students. Students will begin to recognize the difference between languages and how differences influence how things are described. Finally, students will recognize that if you don't know it in English or Portuguese, does not mean you don't know the concept. The issue of language and the teaching of content are strongly interrelated, as just presented. We became interested in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math terminology, when we received our first grant about 15 years ago. At that time, we were just planning to collect a list of ASL STEM signs and develop definitions. Then, simply put this on the web. However, this task turned out to be much more complicated. We found that there was no agreed-upon ASL signs for STEM terminology across schools, across professionals, or even across the community. This was a surprise to us. As experienced teachers, we realized how we approach the issues of content, specifically STEM, impacts how we talk about teaching strategies to enhance learning in these areas. As we began our investigation into the issue, we found that educators and interpreters were just creating signs on the fly when they encountered them. We discovered that many signs for complex STEM concepts were just created and then agreed upon, mostly in individual classrooms throughout the U.S. This meant we had numerous different signs for the same concept. Which one you used depended on where you were located. So what we had were issues of uncontrolled creation of signs and an attitude that any invented sign will do. Unfortunately, this was driven by hearing teachers and interpreters. With a lack of in-depth ASL knowledge and experience in working with STEM concepts. As a result, we decided to do something about this, and we developed ASL Clear. We wanted to develop a resource for the instruction of STEM content in ASL, based on the language principles we discussed to now. We wanted to incorporate the experience and knowledge of people who understand deaf students and who have a background in STEM topics. We collaborated with hearing teachers, interpreters, and deaf teachers, deaf professionals who are biologists, chemists, computer experts, and engineers. This collaboration resulted in ASL Clear, a resource for teachers, students, and families. It is divided into concept units. Each unit contains a micro-lecture associated with a set of STEM terms, definitions, short lectures, and examples. We developed a unique ASL feature search function, which is made up of hand shapes, movements, and locations. It allows deaf students to access all the content using their ASL knowledge. The students are taught how to analyze their signs into hand shapes, movements, and locations as part of their learning about their L1. When inputting these ASL features into the ASL Clear, a list of signs are generated that include the combination of sign components. Then the students select which sign they believe resembles the definition. A short lecture and examples of the concept are also available for more in-depth information. Students may also bring up the English or print of the same information, and they may also use English print to search for the concept. This idea is the same as if you would find in a print dictionary. This process allows students not to be dependent on their knowledge of ASL print. This allows access through their L1. We're in the process of improving the user-friendliness of ASL Clear. For more information, you can go to the website listed on the slide. It is critical for the future of deaf students that more understanding of how to produce and discuss STEM concepts in Libras be as important as learning the language. It is important to establish collaboration across schools and programs serving deaf students. It's important to use technology to work with deaf professionals in the deaf community, to share information and resources, to identify what needs are in the other content subjects, and to devise collaborative ways to achieve them. We need to examine the agreed-upon signs and look for commonality of rules that led to creation, agreement, and use. We need to identify common agreed upon sign language vocabulary for teaching content subjects. This does not mean standardization, but one of agreement and sharing across the country. We need to share the information we find as widely as possible. The most important principle, the results must be vetted by deaf people, by deaf professionals and deaf community members. Lastly, I suggest general principles for bilingual program design. Classroom management is supported by teachers who know sign language discourse and its application to the classroom. Simple devices, such as getting and maintaining attention, are key to engaging students in learning. Problems in identifying learning issues returns us to assessment. Many deaf students are diagnosed as having learning issues below the age of 5. Most deaf students below the age of 5 are barely able to communicate, never mind interact at a level to diagnose disabling learning conditions. We think these issues are historical, but they continue today. With regard to learning disabilities, in our research, we found that LD is an overdiagnosed problem. The real issue is sign language knowledge, fluency, and language deprivation. Thinking about these issues and using a deaf lens will support how to improve learning in deaf students. If a deaf student is identified as having difficulty in learning a sign language, they should be candidates for further testing. Cultural issues are also a huge area that needs discussion. I cannot do it justice here. Deaf students need to understand and learn cultural differences between deaf and hearing worlds. Teaching the differences between deaf and hearing cultures comes out of a partnership with deaf professionals and deaf community members. The professional fields associated with deaf children and deaf adults are dominated by hearing people. Reliance on sign language as a second language is the main discourse of interaction. Many hearing second language users overestimate their abilities in sign language. So outside of the classroom, it's important to remember and respect the need for clear communication with everyone. Some simple rules. In school, sign language is used at all times. In all meetings, it is important to have qualified interpreters so that everyone has full access to the information being presented. Lastly, we must figure out a way to include deaf people in their education and in the education of their future community members. We need to include and hire deaf professionals at the same level as hearing professionals. This means we need more deaf teachers, more deaf professionals to support training of hearing professionals who work with deaf students. Not just teachers, but hospital-based personnel, persons such as speech and language clinicians and early intervention professionals, psychologists, and others who are part of the system that assess and educate deaf children. Working with deaf people and not for deaf people must be our main principle. We must tap the resources of deaf community members. Deaf community members can function as ASL mentors with hearing families. They can mentor and tutor deaf students, especially young deaf students. They can function as ASL models in schools, working with teachers in classrooms. This is an untapped resource in all the countries of the world. Remember, the deaf adults of tomorrow are your deaf students of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hofmeister, for your explanation, and it was very interesting and very uh, exciting to hear you talking about this theme, this subject. Uh, we have some questions from the public, and I want to translate to you. Okay. First is from Gigiani de Paula. She's asking, on regular schools, kids used to have the English subject. I think it's as a second language. And she's asking if it would be better to teach them English print or ASL.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part?
Okay. Uh, she's asking if it would be better to teach these deaf children on regular schools English print or ASL.
So we need to clarify a couple of pieces of information. We need to set up our schools to teach the spoken language through print so that deaf children are exposed to the idea that print is another language compared to the one that they're using on their hands. So to do this, we have to separate and think about the fact that for the children or the deaf children who arrive at school already having a sign language, our job there is to teach those kids about sign language, and that it will be, or we will be able to explain easily that print is another language different from their sign language. So that's one piece of the puzzle to answer. The other piece is that for the kids who arrive at school or who are in school who have not learned or are not fluent in a sign language, we have two important pieces to do with them. First, we have to figure out or establish teaching models to help them acquire and learn sign language. Once they have achieved a certain level of fluency, we can then apply the same principle that we apply to the other students. And that is, we can then begin to teach these kids who've achieved a certain fluency about their sign language. And we'll also be able to clearly explain to them that what they see in print is another language with different rules. And then the classes can become a situation where you use the sign language the children know and the rules that they've learned about that sign language to compare and understand how print is put together and the rules for understanding how print is used. Now, this is not it's easy to talk about it. It's not so easy to do, because we have to remember that many times the kids who don't know sign language very well are going to have more difficulty learning about print. So the better job we do teaching those students about how sign language works and improving their fluency, the easier our job is going to be for them to learn that second language, to learn Portuguese print.
Yeah, it's complex. It's a complex situation. Yeah, I think to teach another language that they are not used to, they have not been involved in it. There is another question from Andrea Chagas Rocha. She's asking, Dr. Hofmeister, can you speak a little bit more about learning L2 by means of explicit teaching?
All right. To learning more about L2 through explicit teaching?
Yes.
Okay. I think in terms of explicit teaching, we have to sort of think of the idea of bilingual. For unlike hearing students, deaf students can't do what I guess we'll call drill and kill, where to learn a second language in the hearing world, there is a way in which a student can repeat what the instructor is saying. Deaf students can't do that. So deaf students have to learn the second language through print through a different mechanism. And I'll refer to that different mechanism as contrasting languages. What has to be done is deaf students need to understand the rules of their first language, and they need to understand how their first language is put together. Once they have this understanding that this language that they use, the signing that they use, has rules and has principles and has formational requirements, you can then use, or then you can discuss the same ideas with regard to print. Simple things. I mean, things that we don't probably think of very much. All of the little diacritics, all of the little information pieces in print that tell us the fact that a space between letters is a word. That's, Russ, that is simple, but for kids, it's not so simple. The fact that an S at the end of one kind of word is not necessarily the same as an S at the end of another kind of word. These kinds of things are important. And you can do this or talk about this by using their knowledge of sign language as understanding what language rules are, what language rules mean. This will help them gain an idea that what they see on their hands, that visual information, follows rules. What they see, and those rules are sign language rules. What they see in print also follows rules, but those are print rules that follow spoken language rules. And therefore, once they gain an understanding of the rules, it's a lot easier to talk about how things work in language 1 and how they work in language 2. This also helps kids are now able to, if they're pretty fluent in L1, they can ask questions about L2. That doesn't happen now. Kids have great difficulty asking you questions about things that they don't understand because they don't know what questions to ask.
Okay. There is another question from Laiane Lima. She's asking, you in USA, how is the proficiency of deaf kids in English print when they finish the basic education?
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that. It didn't come through for me.
In USA, how is the English print proficiency of deaf kids when they finish basic education? How is their proficiency in English print?
This is a difficult question to answer because I think that I might be giving the impression that the United States is doing what I say. And I'm sorry to say that that's not what's happening. So I want to make that clear, that in the United States, they are not doing what I say. They are doing the traditional way. However, I can answer the question from a little bit from this corner. From 2000, the year 2000 to the year 2012, I was lucky enough to work with a couple of schools that implemented our idea. The Learning Center for the Deaf in Framingham, Massachusetts, and the Scranton School for the Deaf in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the Scranton School is closed. But what happened was that we instituted a program in which we had a hearing teacher and a deaf teacher, or a deaf person. Of the deaf person we trained, who worked side by side in the classroom. And the hearing and deaf teacher worked collaboratively to teach deaf students, to teach the formal L1 class, and what I mean by that, to teach about sign language, and also a formal L2 class to teach about reading. And the two teachers worked together to promote an understanding of the L1 rules and an understanding of the L2 rules. So that was sort of part A. Also, a second part was that the deaf person, the deaf professional, the deaf person that worked with us, they also worked in what we'll call the content subject area, in math and science. We'll just stay with those. And the hearing teacher was supported by the deaf person, so that when deaf students didn't understand what the hearing teacher was presenting, let's say in a math concept, the deaf person would re-explain, reanalyze, and help the students through ASL to understand the concepts and how things work. Then, again, both the hearing teacher and the deaf teacher would work with the students to understand how to analyze the print of what they're seeing. We all know that deaf kids have a problem understanding math, language problems in math. In other words, instead of just symbols and equations, you ask a question using words, language math problems. So what I can tell you is that at the end of our 10 years, many of the deaf students that we worked with did very well in displaying their content knowledge of math and science, because we gave them the opportunity, if they couldn't figure out what the print was about, they could ask questions, or if they couldn't write their answer, they could tell us their answer in sign language. That was one part. But the other part that we found most supportive of our work was many of the deaf students learned how to read much, much better. Their reading was almost at grade level. I'm not going to tell you that every student made it to grade level. I'm only going to tell you that on average, the kids that we worked with did a much better job in understanding print, in understanding how to answer questions in print, using the kinds of tests that we all use today, the standard print tests. So, and the kids at the Learning Center, who we still work with today, are doing a lot better. Their reading is improved, their ASL is improved. And as a result, their overall education has improved. So we've walked away from our research with a simple axiom: the better that you know sign language. Both you know how to use it, the fluency, and also the more you know about it, the better you are at learning an L2, learning how to read. Now, this does not mean that kids can't learn how to speak and all of that. That's not part of our framework. Kids who who have the propensity to learn how to speak, they still have access to do that. However, those same kids still work with us in a bilingual framework, and the bilingual framework is sign language and print. It's not spoken language. That's a separate framework that they participate in, but the primary framework is the bilingual sign and print framework. I hope that helps answer the question.
Okay, thanks, Rob. There's another question. Okay, from Swelling Silver. She's asking, what's your better advice for us hearing teachers to be better teachers for deaf students?
I think, for me, it's critical to be the best you can be, the most fluent you can be in sign language. Whether it's, I don't know if it's Libris or LSB, whatever the current term is. It's important to be very fluent in a sign language so that the interaction between you and the students is fluent. The students need to also have you as a model and to respect the fact that you can interact with them without hesitation. Let's put it that way. But secondly, it's also very important that teachers know about the rules of sign language, how sign language is put together, what the rules are that control what good sign language is. Teachers need to understand those rules so that they can help support the development of classes to teach deaf children what the rules of sign language are. Excuse me. Teachers need to understand how to talk about rules, how to talk about the different grammatical constructions in sign language, and not be afraid to talk about it. If they don't know it, they should work with deaf professionals who are trained to work with them, to talk with them, to help them learn about all of these pieces. This is a critical piece to understanding. The reason I say this is that here, if a teacher is well versed in both fluency in the language and knows about all the rules, they'll be able to identify deaf children who are having difficulty learning sign language, and whether their difficulty in learning sign language is just a language delay of input, or that the deaf child has a learning problem. Because one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to throw out a simple answer that sign language is going to solve all the problems. Some deaf children, just like some hearing children, have language difficulties. However, we don't think about language difficulty as being connected with sign language. And so if teachers know this information, it'll be easier to identify kids and separate them out. The ones that have what I'll call language delay as opposed to a language disability. Those children with language delay, they can be worked with, not simply, but they can be worked with by developing a program to improve their learning and fluency in the language, and also their learning about the language. Whereas the children with language disability who are having difficulty learning sign language, more investigation as to what their problem is, whether they have a sign language lexia problem, or it could be neurological. There could be a number of issues. But these are the kinds of things that we need to start looking at. We haven't done this. What's happened is that when deaf kids have trouble learning, we don't know why. And many of them are misappropriately labeled as being learning disabled when the real problem is that their sign language is delayed. And we need to start separating kids out like this.
Bob, we have so many interesting questions here, but we are running out of time. It's about 7, and we have to finish. We would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we would like to have your to have you again with us in other events. We think we will do other ones, and this was amazing for us. We thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And if you want to say anything to finish your presentation, please feel free.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me, for letting me present my ideas. But I want you to know I love Brazil. I've been to Brazil many times, and I love coming to Brazil. We have a great time when we come, and I love meeting hearing and deaf people who work with deaf kids. I've always enjoyed Brazil, and my wife speaks Portuguese, and she loves Brazil. So we come down as often as possible. So thank you, and I wish every one of you the best of luck, and be safe.
Same to you, Bob. Thank you. Bye-bye. We love you.
Love you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.